Welcome, everyone, to the South African Film Festival. I'm Collins Rex, and I'm one of the steering committee members. And I'm absolutely delighted today to be joined by true artists in South Africa who've put together a film that is going to enthrall you, challenge you, make you think, and hopefully along the line also give you a smile or three, because I know it certainly did me. And I am delighted to be joined by Gideon Breytenbach and Riku Lätti. Welcome, guys. And we're really looking forward to chatting to you and to hearing more about your documentary film that is part of the festival this year, the Untamed Stem.
It starts off with a history of the Afrikaans music and the development and why we came to the situation where we are now. Now, the history of South Africa is like, you cannot tell the history of music without the history of the politics of the day. So we had to get some experts to talk about, like, where did we come from all the way today. Now, it's been a topic that's been close to my heart for a very long time. And one of the people that we interviewed there, Dion Maas. Now, we go together a long way. It's a very small industry, a music industry. And so we've been talking about this politics in the Afrikaans music scene for such a long time. And we actually only, it's crazy that we only had one interview with him before he left for Berlin. And he says that he left for Berlin because he couldn't handle the South African system anymore. And he was quite militant about how South Africa, especially now today, is still very stuck in its old apartheid ways. But what we've done is, me and Gideon and actually our now Australian partner, Charles Nadir, and my wife, and obviously Gideon's wife, we were a team. And what we did is we went to go look for true creators, artists in South Africa now, people that actually do create. I'm not talking about just singers, but the real people that write new works into the South African new work. And we went and we basically switched on the cameras and said, tell us your story. Now, the interviews were not about politics at all. But if you look at how many of these people started talking politics, it was obviously very close to the surface. So what Gideon did in his brilliance, he got Dan Roberts, the brilliant producer, that he was also very knowledgeable about the history of Afrikaans music, just to lay down the story from where it came. And then you got political commentators like Dion Maas, like contributing and of making the story a little bit more meat. And then obviously with having hundreds of interviews and live performances of these artists, which we've all still got on tape, of coloring the whole story in and making it real, you actually get to speak to the people who's been affected by this history of South African situation. There is absolutely no space for the brown community that makes a music that sounds a little bit different, a little bit more African, a little bit more different flavors that sounds foreign to these guys that have been bombarded with apartheid-style white music, if you want to call it that. Mm. And now what we've done is we've got some of these artists that we've been working with the Vasgoedlyn for such a long time, our friends, and we let them tell the story. And there's nothing that they can do because there's no hand coming from the white community, the empowered community, the community with the money to say, okay, guys, you guys come with us and let's do something together. It is not happening. What we do is we're doing the future. We are interviewing, we're walking with a guy like Churchill Nadir and basically walking in his current today situation, walk with him, let him talk, let him explain how his life is. So not only do we tell the history, but we also try to give the viewer an insight to the actual the mess that apartheid has left, and then basically hopefully the viewer can see, okay, this is the problem. But unfortunately, the film is so full of facts that we cannot squeeze in part two of the film that needs to be made is how do we go on from here to make the society actually remedy the problem that we have seen.
Yeah,
so,
and it is an interesting conundrum, because the history is one thing, and the film actually beautifully encapsulates that history, and it's a history which is so woven. The music is woven through the language, and the language is woven through the politics, and I guess the irony of this is that Afrikaans as a language was first spoken not by white people, but by brown people.
Exactly.
But somewhere along the line, it became the language of the oppressor. And as a result, the music that it originated was ignored and then eventually lambasted, because in some ways that original music was seen as a caricature.
Yes.
The true roots music that was being produced in Afrikaans, and
Yes.
the film shows this so clearly, was then somehow subverted, and that original stuff was, oh, that's just slightly humorous, weird stuff that happens. That's not real Afrikaans music, which is such a travesty, because so much talent was subverted along the way. Gideon, over the years, I mean, because some of these interviews date back to 2014, I mean, there's an enormous wealth of material that you've used in the film and that you had to work from. How did you select what you eventually used in the film from that enormous archive of material that you'd accumulated?
Yeah, it wasn't an easy task. We wanted to film some of the great regional creating Afrikaans artists in South Africa and do something beautiful, like just see them making music. So try and give them a platform to get out there. And then the politics kind of crept in, because it's inseparable. Afrikaans culture is politics, or South African culture is politics. So I think it was after we shot the interview with Gideon Breytenbach that we really realized there's a thread that needs to be told. And after that, we kind of thought, okay, cool, who can add to the story? Who's big players in the Afrikaans scene that we need to include? When we spoke to Kennedy for Fok of Polisie, who played a big part post-apartheid in creating original Afrikaans music, although not necessarily politically driven. We spoke to Dan Roberts, and all from the start, it was always that Churchill's going to be a big role player in it. He's going to be a big character, because he is the one who suffers at the end of the day. He's the example of the broken system. Massively talented, very politically driven, but the walls are closed. Unless he starts singing Anglo Boer War songs, he's out of the market, because that's if you're brown and you want to get into the market, that's what you have to do. And if it doesn't speak to that criteria or that narrative, unfortunately, it had to go out. We were lucky enough to have another platform. Some of the material went out on TV, more music driven, more storytelling, less politics. So we got the beautiful side of it out. Not that I think the film doesn't get the beautiful side out, but it also touches on the ugly quite a bit. So,
and it's probably impossible to separate the beautiful and the ugly, because the one kind of feeds the other. What was interesting to me was that the film focuses very much on the up-and-coming artists of today. And I say up-and-coming reservedly, because many of these artists are not children. You know, when we think of up-and-coming artists, we think of artists that are in their early 20s and are yet to establish themselves and make a name for themselves. Many of these are mature artists who should already have achieved great heights, but haven't, for all the reasons that you've talked about now. And Churchill, I think, is one of those. But you also do interview and talk to a number of artists that were really popular some years ago, and that were part of the Voelvrye movement, amongst other things, you know, the Barnabas Niemans of this world and Johannes Kerkorrel and so on. And you look at some of that archival footage as well. But that is sort of interwoven with the current crop of artists. And I find it quite interesting that a lot of the older artists that you speak to, the archival artists, are all white. They're white, but they kind of didn't toe the line at the time. And English, yes. You've got this historical reference, and then you've got the modern. And when you look at the artists that were there, and Riku, I'll come back to you on this one. When you look at that progression, do you in fact see any progression at all? Or do you just see that what started as, possibly something that might have gone somewhere, went nowhere for a long time, and now you're reinventing all of that again? Or do you see that there is actually some light?
There is some. Look, the reason why the old artists that we've interviewed were white artists is even like David Kramer, we actually started talking politics accidentally, because I basically said, but David, you're a white guy and this is you, like, but your music doesn't sound white. Like that's what I basically told him. And then he told us of the history of where he went into discovering South African music, and he was interested, and then looking more towards taking what were the brown community doing musically, and then he got some of those elements into his music, and it made it interesting. And I think David Kramer was the only way in that time for white people to actually listen to brown elements in music. They weren't going to go to listen to a brown guy in apartheid's time. So that is the reason why somebody like David Kramer became a name, and a guy like Pieter van der Westhuizen, which is basically his contemporary, is not. And his songs are brilliant. I'm just getting like what's hoendervleis in Engels. Just thinking about
goosebumps.
Goosebumps. I'm getting goosebumps thinking about how beautiful his music is, and it is nowhere on the white radar. If you don't mingle, if you don't mix, how are you going to understand the other side? And that is very important. So it is very important that this white fear will go away the moment that white people start to actually be friends with non-whites. Do you understand? We have this big white fear problem, and it is fear. It is an irrational fear based on the ignorance, the lack of knowledge of other people.
I find it amazing that in this day and age, this conversation is still being had about South African society, that in 2022, you are still having to have this debate and this, let's break down the barriers, let's be friends, let's, sit around the same dining room table, let's listen to the same music.
This is institutionalized within the media industry. The Huisgenoot covers Afrikaans entertainment, news, all of that. It's the biggest, most read magazine in the country, targeting Afrikaans people. But they don't write for the brown speaker of Afrikaans. They create a separate magazine called Keier, and that's just for the brown people. And CakeNet, instead of having an inclusive channel, they do good work and they do try. But instead of doing that, they created CakeNet and Key, which is just targeted at brown people. On other channels, knowledge that I've heard through the grapevine, they'll target they'll say Wednesday nights are for the brown people. So on Wednesday nights, we've only got brown programming. The rest of the nights are for the white people. So instead of their idea of incorporation is by keeping them separate together.
Most people in South Africa do not want a racial situation. They are even tired of the debates because they are good people, mostly good people. But the powers that be will say this works. So now there's three elements. There's a governmental element. The government can do so much to enforce, for instance, quota of percentage of brown music onto predominantly white music channels and radio stations. Commercial stations obviously have a different criteria than the state-owned stations. And then there's the private sector. Now, what the government and the private sector can do is they could have tax breaks for investment on by the private sector into communities that have not been given the same platform. In other words, to say, okay, cool, no tax on the production of music that is made by a new brown singer or black singer. It's no skin off their backs, basically. So it's not like they are taking funds and saying, okay, cool, we're giving it away, because that also doesn't always work. That disappears. And then there's a third thing. The individuals, the public themselves. The private sector is not going to move away from anything that is not money driven. So the tax incentive is quite important, because that is a reason for them to move back towards a more equitable society. But the public, there needs to be some kind of campaign that if you really love, it needs to be born out of love and not out of fear, because fear is destructive, and it's destroying people's reasoning, and it's pushing people further away. There needs to be a situation where, like, we in the new world, we need to focus towards love. If you really realize that how difficult it is to be an artist, support them. And I don't mean, we don't sell CDs anymore. So there needs to be some kind of structure where you can say, look, a guy that loves music and has been listening to music now 24/7 now for the last 10 years. When did Spotify start? Without them paying basically a cent or not the fair share. They should have a system where they can say, look, I feel that in the past I used to spend this much on music, and now I want to still do that because I love music and I love artists. And there should be a way, and it is very easy to do with these clever computer web-driven developers that can make a gateway between artists and people that want to basically support them. So if somebody makes a beautiful video and they basically don't have the platforms, people should be shown, hey, look, this guy, and if you want to help him, because selling music, in the Brown community, I have this, one of the Vascotlane artists' most watched artist is a Meligray who lives in basically from township to township. Now, we've recorded him. His downloads are incredible. There's so many people, but when I see the stats, it's like thousands and thousands of non-paying revenue streams, non-paying. Whereas somebody like Albert Frost or Handel Niemand has only a percentage of those views, but those views comes from channels that actually do pay. So it's different. So what we need to do is I don't know what that structure is, but there needs to be a compassionate system where people can actually give, because there are people that want to give to the people that need it. The pop stars that are generating the biggest income at the moment from people's hearts are the guys that don't need it anymore. The guys that have 10 million followers. And they say, oh, this COVID hit me so hard. What am I going to do? And the next thing you know, there's an online concert and it raised him 2 million. But he already had his white bucky and his mansion and whatever. Yeah. Whereas it's
interesting. I mean, I find it very interesting, Riku, because, you know, we're talking about artists that make music in a specific language. You know, we're talking essentially about artists who produce music in Afrikaans, which is an indigenous language. Then you have other languages that do manage to do incredibly well internationally. And I mean, you can't go past the enormous success of Master KG's Jerusalema. Because it was catchy and it was funky and no one understood a word of it because it's in Xhosa, and it doesn't matter because it has transcended and it somehow became this beacon of light in COVID times, and people were singing it on balconies in downtown Rome and, you know, in war-torn Syria. And for me, it's finding the secret sauce. And how do you apply that secret sauce to an artist like Churchill Nordia?
The answer is radio stations. Radio stations really need to play more music that will actually educate the taste buds or the earbuds for listening more broadly and more widely. And at the moment, when you hear something that's slightly foreign, it is so foreign that you just say, okay, cool, no, let me go to another channel. I think the repetition of putting the sound that is a little bit different on and more to the forefront, that will change the whole thing. And then the people will start to realize, but you know what, that weird sounding tune, now that the third time, it's actually starting to cook and it's biting me and I'm moving and now I'm going to dance with it and they dance funny and I'm also going to dance funny and I'm going to have enjoyment. So there is pleasure to be had. There is a beautiful, wonderful a vars water pool, a fresh place to go and jump into and live in the enjoyment. If we get this right, there is going to be a big reward. But at the moment, out of fear of losing some voices of some people, the kanale, the channels, they don't want to play music that is sounding even slightly different from what they are already playing. And that is the problem.
We, for example, in Melbourne, we have a radio station called PBS, which is a public broadcasting service. And they specialize in music that is not heard anywhere else. So you have some really way out crazy reggae guys, and you have an African music segment on a Sunday afternoon. It's called Flight 1067 to Africa. And the chap that runs it is a guy named Stanley Goma. And Stanley plays music from one end of the African continent to the other, and he plays some really out there stuff from time to time. I've never heard Stanley, and I know Stanley quite well, I've never heard him play a Churchill Nordia. And I think it's because he doesn't know of his existence. And maybe that is part of the answer, is that it's not, the answer isn't in South Africa, perhaps. Perhaps the answer is breaking some of these artists internationally. And then South Africa will want to embrace them.
So you are right. We need to get to international market and put Churchill on an international stage. And that is why I really think this film festival is going to do, hopefully it is going to make the situation where this debate that we are having now, that people in South Africa do not want to have this debate anymore. They don't feel white privilege is a thing.
And one can only hope that something like a South African film festival that is held on the other side of the world entirely manages to at least start breaking down some of those barriers, you know, if nothing else within the expat South African community. So, Gideon, in the time that we have left, why do people, and I'm not talking about former South Africans, I'm talking about Australian and New Zealand audiences, why do these people need to see this film?
I think for the same reason that Bernaldus Niemand, who was an Englishman, James Phillips, Lloyd Ross, became the founding fathers almost of the full frame movement, was because from the outside, it looks bad. When you're in it, I was born Afrikaans, I grew up Afrikaans, I went to an Afrikaans church, I'm an Afrikaans school, I listened to Afrikaans music, which was only white music. The realization is a lot harder to go through. And I think people from the outside seeing it really gets it. It's easier to see from the outside and realize what's happening there is not good and something needs to be done about it. And I think more voices from outside can help maybe bring about change. So, and I think this film is what we're trying to do. We're trying to shine light on it. And then, as Riku said, we haven't given any solutions to the problem as yet. But that's what we want to do now is investigate those and see what can be done.
Go look at some of those videos of the original creators, of the original guys, and say, that's where the tune came from. It is there. There's plenty. There's so much. And you can go in any town in South Africa and ask, who's the guy that plays the guitar? And you're going to find tunes. And that's hopefully in 2 films' time, we've solved the problem and we can just go down the street and bring all these other guys, the beautiful songs together, and that's the film.